everyone. Unfortunately, as you can see, Matthew is not here, as far as we can see. He's going to join via Zoom, and he's going to explain a little bit what happened. We've had to make a change. It was going to be this in-person simulation attempt, which was also had a fair chance of failing as well, but we already failed to have both of us here, and that's fine. What we're going to do is do more of a talk where we're going to go through some of the ideas and approaches that can help you with remote work, especially when we're talking about team interactions in a remote setting. And so this will be more of a talk. I'm sorry that we won't be able to run the exercises that we were hoping for. You'll get some of the key takeaways that we were expecting you to have from the exercise will be via just a regular talk and slides, but hopefully it's still helpful to you. Matthew, maybe you want to share?
Sorry I can't be with you. I tested positive for COVID a couple of days ago, so I didn't think it was a very sensible thing to come to London and share that with you. And it's also, Manuel and I decided that it was not the right thing to do to try and run the simulation sort of semi-remotely. One of the things that we're really keen to do is, because this is a physical in-person conference, we wanted to make sure that it was a real physical in-person kind of experience for everyone. So we didn't want to try and do something which was kind of half-baked. We do have it all planned out, and as Barry pointed out to us in the email, there's another SEACON planned for November this year. So either then or at some point soon, we'll aim to run this in-person simulation. It's a simulation for about 50 people altogether, plus some observers. Anyway, you'll hopefully get a flavor of what that feels like. The idea was to use an in-person event to highlight the absurdities of some of the behavior that we see in remote-first contexts, because we would not expect to do some kind of behaviors in person, and yet loads of organizations are doing those things remotely. So that's what we're trying to get at.
All right. So the previous talk really fits in with what we're going to talk about now. It was really interesting, the story from Red Hat. And so me and Matthew are the authors of the book, Team Topologies. Maybe some of you have heard about the book. And really, this quote is important because it talks about the fact that what we try to achieve with Team Topologies is really a set of tools and some concepts and approaches for finding better operating models, especially in the digital age, if you like. And so it's really not about figuring out what is the ideal model for our organization. It's really understanding here's a set of tools, of thinking tools and approaches that can help us evolve the organization, evolve the teams in the right direction, right? So it's very important to think about this evolutionary approach. And it makes a lot of sense for remote work as well. So if anyone is selling you the perfect remote hybrid design model for your teams, that I would be a bit suspicious, right? You're going to have to try things out and evolve and figure out what's working, what's not working, and move on. And so we have now a workbook on remote team interactions. It came out already, but it's only available on the IT Revolution app. So the kind of worldwide release is going to be late April, May. So that's where all the formats will be available. And so this talk is sort of going through some of the key ideas in the workbook, okay? Some of the early readers of the book, like Stefan, found it valuable to have practical exercises and approaches and some techniques to evolve, like I said, our remote approach and figure out what are the things that need to be improved, what's working, what's not working. A lot of this is based on some simple techniques and templates that are freely available on GitHub. /Team Topologies is Creative Commons, so you're totally free to use them. And so by now, I would expect all of you, but for some people, this was quite new to understand that remote work is not just about having Zoom and Slack installed and available in the organization. Obviously, we need the tooling, but that's I would dare say even just a small part of what we need to be thinking about. We also need, as mentioned before, psychological safety, obviously, and we need ground rules and practices that are going to help people work together, especially when we're talking about different teams working together, right? Within each team is fairly reasonable that they find solutions. They have maybe a social contract like we saw in the previous talk. But when you're talking about interactions between different teams in a remote context, it gets a little bit more tricky, right? And what happens is that if we don't think about this, if we have poor remote interactions between teams, that can effectively challenge seriously any kind of transformation your organization might be trying to go through, whether, you know, it's a DevOps transformation or digital transformation, whatever you want to put in there, is going to be strongly affected if the teams are not able to interact well in a remote context. So this is what we're going to see during this presentation, starting with team dependencies. That's obviously a very important aspect. And when we're talking about this remote-first context, it's really vital to understand, first of all, who is working on what, right? Because we cannot realistically remove all dependencies between teams. There's always going to be dependencies. What kind of dependencies exist is another story. But we're working together in this remote context. We need to understand what are other teams working on, right? What is their backlog? What is their roadmap, et cetera. So one thing we shouldn't do is leave up to just, you know, synchronous touch points where maybe we have a call every number of weeks to have the teams come together and discuss their roadmaps. Ideally, we would have a much more kind of self-serve approach where teams can figure out what are other teams working on, especially when we depend on some other team to provide something to us, that we have visibility on that, right? You don't want to have to wait for some coordination meeting that's taking place in 4 weeks or 6 weeks to figure out what's happening elsewhere. And so one way to do that is with a team API. So the social contract or team working agreement, sometimes it's called as well, as we saw in the previous talk, are for one team internally to decide, you know, how do we like to work? What are the practices that we adopt? What are the way that we like to work together as a single team? But then how does that translate to other teams, right? So the team API, obviously based on the idea of application programming interface, but basically we're saying, think about what is the interface for your team. Look outwards and think about what do other teams need to know about us and the way we work, what are we working on, et cetera. And so we came up with this idea of a team API to reflect that. And so there are a number of artifacts that you can, and approaches that you can include in the team API. There'll probably be a strong overlap with a social contract in the team. But especially important in this remote context is to have clarity on what is our roadmap as a team, what are our priorities, what are we working on, and how do we like to communicate, which channels, which hours of the day, do we have open office approach, whatever it might be. Whatever the team decides makes sense for us, make that visible to others, right? So we're clarifying kind of the environment so that other teams have a much easier time understanding and talking to us if they need to. This is, there's a simple template available. It's one of those GitHub techniques and templates that you can have a look at. So it's pretty straightforward. There's no rocket science here, but it's just, the key thing is to have this outwards approach. Think about what other teams need to know about us, about the work we do. And we really think that for effective team-first ownership of software, teams need to continuously define, advertise, test, and evolve their team API. And that's, again, even more important in a remote or hybrid context. And so talking about dependencies between teams, first visualize the work, make it available in this sort of effectively self-serve way that other teams can find out what are we doing, when are things going to be ready, what is the priorities, et cetera. And then we can look at tracking dependencies between teams. And this can be done in very simple ways. Again, this is actually coming from that original Spotify paper that gave birth to the Spotify model approach. In fact, there were other things they were doing that were talked about in that article, which were really interesting. And one of them was this dependencies tracking sort of matrix, where it's quite simple. It's each team having clarity on which other teams do they depend on for what, and especially what kind of dependency is that today. Is it an okay dependency? It doesn't really block us or stop us from doing our work, or it kind of slows us down a little bit. We have to wait maybe a couple of days for some infrastructure to be ready, or we have to wait a couple of days for some review from another team. Or is it something blocking, meaning if we're working on a feature or some other piece of work, we have to stop and we have to wait for some other team to come back to us. And so obviously we're going to start doing more work in parallel. We might start some other tasks, some other items, but we're not able to move on with this piece that we wanted to deliver, right? So that's where we have a blocking dependency. And so being able to differentiate what kind of dependencies we have on other teams is super important, so that then we can do something about it. There are other ways to visualize dependencies between teams. So this book, Making Work Visible by Dominic de Grandis, has a lot of great tips. Some of them need to be adapted to a remote context, but in general, you can use your boards to identify dependencies on work, on dependencies on other teams, etc. What we want to do really is then address the blocking dependencies. Ideally, start looking at ways to eliminate them. Maybe we need to mitigate some slow dependencies, and we can keep healthy dependencies, right? So we're not having this kind of naive approach that we think we can remove all dependencies and work totally isolated. That's never going to be the case, or very unlikely for any team to be able to do that. So we need to figure out what dependencies do we have. Are they blocking? Are they okay? Or they're slowing us, and address the ones that are more impacting our flow, our speed. Another aspect that is important to consider for remote contacts is natural trust boundaries. So this is part of our human nature, is that we have different trust levels based on the groups that we're part of. So smaller groups will have higher trust, and the larger the group that we're part of, the lower the trust. And so this has impact in a remote context as well. So what we shouldn't do is have a naive setup of online chat tools or other tools for communication where we're not thinking about flow, we're not thinking about what are the real communication needs, what are the groups that are formed, and how will people feel in those groups. Again, if they're placed in a large group with little context where they don't really know who else is there, then they're not going to feel very engaged or confident to participate as much. So group trust boundaries are important. So this is coming from the work of Robin Dunbar. So you might have heard of Dunbar's number, which talks about an individual social network size. The number of meaningful relationships that any person can have is in the order of 100 to 200 individuals. So usually we talk about 150, which is the average, as Dunbar's number. So if we keep this in mind, how might this affect the way we set up our chat tools, we set up our online workspaces? So these are roughly the trust boundaries that Robin Dunbar found, going from kind of between 5 and 15, which we talk about as, especially for knowledge-intensive work, it's usually up to 9 is kind of ideal for deep trust. But as you can see, there are other trust levels. So if we know this and we understand the impact this has on how people engage and how people feel part of a group, we can use that, right? We understand that the dynamics change when people cross these different Dunbar boundaries, these trust boundaries. So we shouldn't expect them to behave in the same way. And so to give you an example, it's actually from Team Topologies, one of the case studies from AutoTrader. I'm guessing most of you are familiar with their work. And so in this example, in this case study, they were talking about how they had invested, obviously pre-pandemic, they had invested quite strongly in a physical office with kind of thinking about what is the setup that's going to help us be more productive, achieve faster flow, etc. So they actually have, or had each kind of business domain mapped out to one of the floors in this building, in their office. And so all the teams, for example, working on commercial car sales were working on the same floor, whether that was technology teams, marketing, sales, legal, etc. So they had some really interesting results from that as well, where there was kind of cross-pollination of approaches between these teams. They saw some marketing teams, for example, starting to use Kanban boards. So really interesting stuff. But especially they wanted the communication between those teams that were in the same business domain to be quite fluid, right? So they were on the same floor. So how does this translate to the virtual world is the question you're probably asking, right? And so whether using Slack or Teams or something else, kind of the tendency is to just, let's have a Slack for everyone in the organization, right? So you might have hundreds, thousands of people in the same workspace. But if we look at the trust boundaries, that means people are in this huge group where they are not necessarily going to feel like they trust that they even know who else is in this workspace, in these channels that we have set up. And so maybe a better approach, if we're thinking about trust boundaries, is to think, what is the limit that we should have for the same workspace, right? And maybe what we can do is have multiple instances of these workspaces, right? So maybe we want to limit to 500 people, for example, because we know that's kind of one of the trust boundaries, where after that, just it's very difficult for people to even know who else is in that workspace. So this is not necessarily what AutoTrader did, but in that example, we could expect that, well, we can apply that same idea to have different workspaces limited to the size where we know there's kind of stronger trust or reasonable trust between people, right? So we might have different instances of these tools to allow for that. And therefore, not having this naive approach that we just have a single tool for everyone to be together and everyone can communicate with everyone else. That's not going to be very effective or promote, even in some cases, not going to promote psychological safety. The other thing we should avoid is expect that we can sort of shout out in the Slack or in any kind of communication tool that we just shout out some request and expect that magically someone's going to answer, right? Imagine if you're in the office and someone stands up and shouts, where is that report that I need? Probably it's not going to be seen very well, right? So there's no reason why in a virtual environment we should expect those things to be okay or be the way that we achieve a good flow, a good communication, right? So we shouldn't expect that. We need better, kind of more structured approach to this. And so this is just an example. The point is we need to think about what kind of instances do we need for our chat tools and other types of communication tools, and then what kind of structures do we need inside them. Some simple naming conventions can go a long way, where in this example, you can see we have usually each team has their own channel, right? But then we might have some channels, like at the bottom left, where we might say, stream team 1 is working with the platform team, collaborating on a monitoring service, for example. So we might have some temporary channels just for that interaction take place. So now you know this is where we get together. If both teams agree, this is where we talk about the work we're doing together, the collaboration, and it's very straightforward what needs to happen. Obviously, for individuals, they should also make sure it's clear what is their role, which team they work on, so it's easy for other people to understand who they're talking to. So again, nothing groundbreaking, some simple naming conventions and ground rules to help us remove the noise. And so these are some example conventions. Doesn't mean that you need to adopt this. Just think about what makes sense for your teams. So we're having a team-first approach to this organization of our virtual workspaces. And the point there is that this is going to help increase discoverability, make it easy for teams to find out who they have to talk to, where are they located virtually, and when is a good time to talk to them. So the team API helps already with that, and then having these simple conventions is going to increase discoverability and effectively reduce cognitive load on communications, right? Because cognitive load can take many forms. And one of the forms is, especially when we move to a virtual remote setting, is that now there's more cognitive load just figuring out where people, when can I talk to certain people, which channel, et cetera, right? Things that before we were in the office and maybe I know they're sitting on the floor above me, I'm just going to go up and talk to them, right? Now those things are taking up cognitive capacity as well. So we want to reduce that, reduce noise, make things clear for teams. And the last part I want to talk about is how do we make interactions more purposeful, more intentional. Again, these are key for effective teams anywhere in any kind of environment, but especially remote. But you need to have more clarity on what kind of interactions should we have with other teams, when should we have those interactions, for how long. So we shouldn't expect, now that we're in a remote setting, that collaboration is going to be easier or cheaper because we're just using chat tools and everyone can communicate with everyone else. That's not necessarily true, or not likely true. It's going to actually cost more in this setting. And we should not, we cannot talk to everyone else just to get some piece of work done, right? We need to have clarity on what are the dependencies we have on other teams, who do we need to collaborate with or we need to interact with. So in team topologies, we define 3 specific interaction modes: collaboration, 2 teams working together to figure out a specific solution to a problem for a period of time. We talk about then X as a service, as one team provides a service internally that other teams consume. So in general, you wouldn't expect that you actually need to communicate much. It's just the service available, easy to understand, easy to use. And finally, facilitating, where typically one team that might have some expertise, some deeper knowledge on some domain is going to help other teams kind of upskill and have a very quick and a very short learning curve to learn more about some domain. That's, of course, the definition in 10 seconds. And so with the types of teams that we talk about in team topologies and these interaction modes, we can then have a better idea and even visualize what's happening in the short term, which teams are collaborating with other teams, which teams are facilitating, which services do we have internally that can be consumed. And so that helps us, again, have a better picture, like I was saying in the beginning. If this is our current model, this is what's happening, what do we need to do next? If we have some challenges, let's say in data science or machine learning, maybe we need to figure out how we're going to address that. Maybe we need an enabling team, or we need some facilitating to happen, et cetera. So we're kind of on this continuous loop, if you like. We're addressing the challenges and figuring out how these specific interactions and teams can help us. And so specifically, we should try to allow the real needs that teams have from the work they're doing drive the interactions. When they realize, well, we need help to understand better this domain, maybe we need help to understand how to do infrastructure as code or how to do some tests, et cetera, and we know there's this other team that can help us, that's, we're driving interactions by real needs. Or, there's some dependencies on the architecture level that 2 teams need to work together to figure out how we're going to implement some change. So we shouldn't restrict interactions between teams to some sort of formal processes. And sometimes when some organizations moving to a remote approach had that tendency to, well, let's have more processes in place because we know it's more complicated. Let's have more processes to help teams understand when to communicate with other teams. But that's not really what we should be doing. We should be finding ways to simplify communication, simplify interactions so that teams then can resort to those when they need them. And so, for example, one of the things we could have in a team API is actually have teams describe what kind of interactions they need to have with other teams, right? So this is from a very practical point of view. We might have one team, in this example, Streamline team, that needs to be facilitated on test automation, and they're collaborating with a platform team on the monitoring and telemetry service, right? So we have a very clear idea of what kind of interactions are needed, when are they taking place, how long they're going to last. And that doesn't mean that these interactions are always going to happen perfectly and everyone's going to be happy. There's going to be awkwardness in some interaction, things that don't go as planned. We didn't find the solution to what we were, that we were looking for, or I don't know, one of the teams didn't feel like the interaction went as they expected, or it took too long. And so we can use those kind of reflections and awkwardness to understand what else needs to happen. Maybe some interactions sort of didn't play out as expected because one of the teams maybe didn't have the knowledge that was needed to have that collaboration, for example, or something else is the problem. And so it's not that we're expecting the interactions to be always kind of perfect and give the exact results we expected, but we use the times when they don't work out to understand what else do we need. And obviously this already has been mentioned before, but again, we need to clarify communication purpose and channels, especially for teams like platform teams where they might have many internal users or teams providing some sort of internal product or internal service. It's even more important to clarify what are the communication channels, when should you use different channels, etc. So there's a very simple template, or you can create your own for teams to kind of provide information, again, thinking about what other teams need to know. What kind of services do they provide, but especially what are the communication channels? Do we have different Slack channels for different purposes? Maybe if there's an incident, we want you to contact us on this channel because we're going to be responding faster. Or maybe even you can call us or something else. Versus other channels that maybe we use for feedback, for general requests and questions. So we're getting to the end. Just to kind of summarize and give you an idea of what might be some next steps for you to think about in this remote setup. Like we saw, track, visualize, and remove blocking dependencies when you can. You can use those simple tracking tools that are going to help you identify the problems and then use the team interaction modes to maybe figure out how we're going to remove this dependency. So sometimes we could use, for example, collaboration to have two teams figure out how do we remove this dependency. So we depend on you to provide us X. How do we find a different way that we can do X without depending on your team, if that's blocking us and causing flow issues? Using the team API approach to define and communicate the responsibilities and the focus of the team and what we're working on. Leveraging the natural group trust boundaries to set up more engaging online spaces where people feel safer to communicate and have less kind of noise in their communication. Clarify the purpose and channels that we're using in order to help also reduce cognitive load for other teams around communication. Listen to awkward team interactions that might indicate also that maybe the communication patterns were not clear or need to be improved. That might be one of the reasons as well. We should also invest in building informal networks for long-term success. It's now pretty common to hear people say, well, I work in a team for 2 years, I've never met anyone else in the team face-to-face, right? Only online. And so that's within a team. But again, between different teams, this tends to be even more complicated. So you might have a lot of people in your organization that you've never even have a video call with them. You haven't even seen their face. And so investing in formal networks, so there are many ways you can do this, communities of practice, internal conferences, lunch, talks, etc. But invest in this because in the long term, even if today might not be seen as an issue, those informal networks are going to keep the organization able to identify who can help us with some problems that we might have, not now, but maybe in 6 months or in a year or 2 years from now. If we have these networks, we're going to remember, I remember someone in that other team had a similar problem. I'm going to talk to them. But just in general, these networks are going to be important to keep kind of the organization glued together, if you like. Finally, focus on the user experience internally. right? Especially for teams that are providing services or products to other teams. Focusing on the satisfaction that they have with our products is going to help us also identify, what are the other interactions that might need to happen? What are some gaps where we realize that some teams are maybe not satisfied because we haven't really paid attention to their needs or we haven't communicated with them. And so actually doing simple things like a survey or some other simple technique that gives us an idea of what other teams think of us and our services is going to be quite helpful. And that's it for the talk. Just a few pointers. I'm going to do a book signing at Red Hat just after this talk. We have a number of resources on our website on teamtopologies.com. The tools are available on GitHub, or you can go through this link, teamtopologies.com/tools, those simple techniques and templates. We have an academy online as well. Some people have asked what we're working on, and so one of the main things in 2022, later this year, we hope to have kind of a more structured approach to assessing cognitive load, measuring cognitive load, and kind of figuring out as we maybe make some decisions, make some changes to try to reduce cognitive load, is that really happening or not? So that's what we're working on this year. And that's it. I'm going to let Matthew, see if Matthew wants to add anything that I've missed. And thank you for listening. And maybe we can get Matthew on the screen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Manuel. So I think the only thing to say really is that we've been quite pleased about the extent to which all the stuff in Team Topologies actually, or most of it, translates pretty well into the remote first space. Some of the details change ever so slightly, but the principles have really held up. We wrote the book well before the pandemic. It was published in September 2019, which obviously is before, I think, even the first infection. But because Team Topologies is very much focused on clarity of kind of principles, clarifying concepts and intent, this matches very much with what many of the kind of remote first approaches have been talking about over the last 10, 15 years anyway. Which is make things much clearer, provide kind of space for people to discover things asynchronously, and then you can focus in on having a small amount of time for kind of synchronous catch-ups, which then become very, very valuable because people have got all the context beforehand. I think it probably helps with Team Topologies that we've got a very visual way of representing teams, and it's very flow-oriented. So the diagram that Manuel showed partway through, these diagrams are very flow-oriented. They're very much about the flow of change through the organization. And it's the visual language there can maybe help to help people to talk through things. You use that visual language as opportunity for a conversation effectively. And in fact, at the Red Hat stand, they've got some of the printed team shapes, which I'll show you in a second. They look like this, so it's like a packet of team shapes like this. And these are things that we designed. They're all kind of pre-cut. Can you see that? They're all pre-cut. You pop out the shapes. Oops, I popped one out accidentally there. There we go. So streamlined team shape in yellow. And so you can literally use it on a physical desk and use that with colleagues in the same space to facilitate a conversation about what kind of interaction should we have. You can use a physical space like that to design the remote first space. There's a way of using these tools together to become extra effective. So I think if you're interested, it's worth going along to the Red Hat stand. Have a look at those as well, even if you've already got the book signed.
All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy lunch.